This is Colin Cordwell, your host for Red Lion Pub Hub. This is our second episode. In the first episode, we discussed ghost stories. This one, I want to discuss a topic which has always been kind of near to me. It's about people who've almost become ghosts, about the near-death experience. My interest in near-death experiences goes back quite a ways, probably over 45 years. And I have to talk about the genesis of it because as a small child, I had an inconsolable fear of death. My father would put me on his knee and would talk to me and try and talk me out of it. And I have no idea where the fear originated, but it had remained in the back of my mind for the good portion of my early life. And it wasn't until I worked in a hospital in high school during the days when I thought I would become a doctor that I became interested in this area called the near-death experience. I worked at a hospital in Chicago as an orderly around 1973 to 1975. And I worked in a unit which was known as a rehab ward, which was actually more accurately a terminal unit. We had a lot of people in this ward who were dying of cancer, who were being decimated by diseases, which some of them we can cure now, but at the time it was just a matter of time. So I dealt with people at various stages of dying, of rejection of the idea of dying, and eventually of acceptance. And it was about this time that one of the first books about near-death experiences came about. It was a book called Life After Life by Raymond Moody, who was a psychiatrist who compiled the stories and events of 150 people who went through the near-death process. I read the book and devoured it, and I was consumed by this possibility of people surviving physical death. It's interesting because Shakespeare refers to death as the undiscovered country. In Act 3, Scene 1, Hamlet says, "To grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than to fly to others that we know not of." So this was a question which was always in the back of man's mind. It was certainly in the back of my mind. I would talk to my patients. I would get to know their inner fears, their strengths, and how they looked at this final chapter of their life. And when I read Moody's book, I discovered that sometimes what we think is death is just a door. I went through many doors myself, discovering various layers of what the near-death experience was to different people. And I discovered that this event happened to quite a few people, and I collected stories over the years, and I devoured books pertaining to this particular area. I discovered that Plato discussed this at the end of the Republic, when he recounted the death of the warrior in battle. And evidently who was thought to be dead, came back to life on his funeral pyre. And he described to others where he had been. He had been to this other land. And he noted in quite detail that there were 2 roads that went to the sky, and there were 2 roads that went to the ground. And he discussed that those who were righteous could go into the sky, and those who weren't went into the ground. And it was one of the earliest accounts of the near-death experience. We take what Plato said because we take what the Greeks have taught us, which is what it was to be human. what our strengths are, where our fears lie, and how we adapt to them. Raymond Moody, in his book Life After Life, collected 150 stories of people who had gone through the near-death experience, and they're really, when it was brought up, it seemed to be anecdotal. There was no criteria by which to really say, okay, is this true, or is this a figment of the imagination? Is this anoxia? Is this lack of oxygen? Are people hallucinating? A student of Dr. Moody's was Dr. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist, and he's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Michigan. He developed a criteria for the near-death experience, which were numbered, and he had a scale, the highest scale number being 37. But one category was those who died came to a border. Another was there was a tremendous feeling of peace and pleasantness. There were feelings of joy, and they saw a bright light. They lost awareness of their body, and there was a complete awareness of everything. They seemed to enter another domain. They were received by deceased relatives, and time seemed to stand still completely. Many of these cases, there was a transcendental component of meeting spiritual beings. The torch of studying near-death experiences was taken up by numerous people in the medical field, not least of which was Dr. Peter Brook Cardigan Fenwick, who was a neuropsychiatrist and a neurophysiologist who was known for his studies in epilepsy and the end-of-life phenomena. And he postulated that when the heart stops, brain activity ceases to occur. If the brain activity does keep going on, then there was an area which really needed to be looked at. Then consciousness itself possibly was not generated by the brain itself. Another doctor who worked in this area was Dr. Sam Parnia, who wrote a book called Erasing Death. He did a lot of work with heart attack victims, and he noticed that the heart attack victims were the best patients to work with in this particular field because of the suddenness of death and the ability to bring people back and finding out what had been experienced. A Dutch cardiologist by the name of Dr. Pim van Lommel also worked on this separately, and he noticed that there was a certain percentage of his patients who suffered heart attacks and died were brought back and were able to tell what had happened to them during the time they were supposedly dead. Detractors of this would say, well, this probably happened in a fraction of a moment at the beginning of the dying of the brain. And Parnia himself said that was the most important part, was to localize events during this to show that the person's mind or consciousness actually existed outside of the human body and could pinpoint conversations or actions that took place during the event. For doctors to study this phenomena was one thing. For the phenomena to happen to doctors was another. In recent years, books have come out written by MDs who had personally gone through the near-death experience. One that comes to mind was of neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander, who died back in the early 2000s, and he describes his near-death experience, and from all accounts, he was flatlined and with zero brain activity. He's been interviewed by countless people. He's been on many talk shows, and he's written a book called Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife. And it describes his near-death experience in great detail. Another book written by an MD was Mary C. Neal. She was a doctor who had a very vivid near-death experience. She wrote a book called To Heaven and Back, in which she recounted her near-death experience. So it's one thing for doctors to study the near-death experience. There's another for doctors who have gone beyond the veil and have come back and described it. And for many, it's rewritten their understanding of what the human body is. There's more than meets the eye. For the human body, it's just an organism. There's something which has to drive it. For me to read all these books written by doctors and their studies was one thing. for me to hear these stories from people who'd actually gone through near-death experiences was another. In my line of work, I meet hundreds of people. They come through the pub, and you hear people's many, many stories, their lives. They come and tell you their problems. Sometimes, depending on your mood, you wind up telling them your problems. But I found how not uncommon it was for people to have experienced the near-death experience. It would come up in conversation, and some of the people would tell it to me in such matter-of-fact ways that I thought, wow, this was as natural to them as getting dressed in the morning. One story I remember was of a woman who I knew, I shall call her Julia, whose husband was a doctor, and whose son I knew personally, who later became a doctor. And I asked her one day, I said, Julia, for some reason, I said, do you know anybody who's ever had a near-death experience? And she said, yeah, I died delivering George. And I said, you're kidding. And she said, no. In fact, it was a very difficult birth, and I was in labor, and I went through this intense pain, and then I blacked out. When I woke up, I was looking down on myself, and I was watching the doctor working on me. All of a sudden, this tunnel opened up to my right, and I went shooting down this tunnel at a tremendous speed. And I was heading towards this beautiful, beautiful light. When I got there, it was the most amazing feeling I'd ever felt in my life. It was an all-encompassing love. It was a feeling of total acceptance. I was met by two women who said they were very happy to see me, but they didn't think it was my time, and they introduced themselves to me as my grandmothers. The interesting thing was, she said, I never met my grandmothers. They died long before I was born. Well, as one thing led to another, I had the short conversation with this light that spoke to me in very loving terms and said, what would you like to do? You have a decision to make. And she said, well, I want to stay here with you. I've never felt anything like this before. But I have one child who I have already, and I have this other child who I'm trying to bring into the world, who I think I love. And the light said, well, you go back and do your job, and I'll come for you another time. So she went back, and in the ICU the next day, she talked to the doctor, who was a family friend, and she told him everything which had happened to her during the procedure. And she said he went white. He asked her if she had talked to any attending physicians or nurses, and she said no. He said, because you were dead and we were trying to get you back. But everything she had told him was pertinent and was exactly as it happened. When she got home, she told her mother about the grandmothers. Her mother didn't say a word. She said, just hold on a second. She went up into the attic and brought down 2 boxes and put them in front of her and said, take a look through these. She went through the boxes and she took out 2 or 3 photographs and correctly identified the women who were her grandmothers. And these things kind of fall into place of what Bruce Grayson had in his categories about being met by relatives, by being met by celestial beings. Another friend of mine, I shall call Tom, was a Vietnam vet. And I asked him one day, I said, Tom, do you know anybody who's died, been brought back? He says, yeah, I was killed in a battle in Vietnam. I said, really? What happened? He goes, well, it was 1971. We were fighting the NVA. He was a Marine, by the way. And he was a police officer at present when he was telling me the story. He said, we were fighting the NVA. There was a tremendous explosion. And when I woke up, I was looking down on myself. And the battle was silent. And I didn't recognize myself because I was covered in blood. And I had a huge piece of metal sticking out of my jaw. And I watched the Vietnamese soldiers bayonet the 2 guys next to me, and they left me alone because they figured I was dead. Well, I suppose I was, because I was looking at it from another angle. All of a sudden, this tunnel opened up to my right, and I started going down this tunnel at a tremendous speed. It was almost like I was sitting in a chair going 200 miles an hour towards this light. When I got there, it was as if somebody slammed the door on me, and a voice said, someone will be right with you. And presently, my grandmother came up to me. She died while I was in Vietnam. And she said, honey, it's so good to see you, but it ain't your time. He says, what do you mean, Grandma? He says, you have to go back. And this light, this incredibly bright light, spoke to me and said, I have other things I want you to do. you're going back. He said, I don't want to go back. He said, you're going back. And it was as if somebody turned around by the shoulders and pushed him back down the tunnel. He said, I followed the helicopter that they put my body in, and I watched them take my body out of the helicopter and put it in a tent. And I seemed to float over to the tent and drifted down through it into my body, and I came to, and I started cursing at the top of my lungs. He said, you SOBs, why did you bring me back? And he said it was the most beautiful feeling he'd ever experienced. And he said the last thing he wanted to do was to come back to this. He had a second near-death experience when he went out as a police officer. He went out a second-floor window with an assailant. They wound up being taken over to the county hospital. And my friend was from the South, and he said the surgeon that was working on it had a Stars and Bars bandana on, and he could hear in his headphones that he was listening to Lynyrd Skynyrd. And he left his body and was standing next to him. He goes, hey, buddy, way to go. And his grandmother came up to him again, and she said, look, don't fool around, okay? You have a job to do, and you have a time. And once your time, me and some other people will help you over. But get back in there. And she made him get back into his body. The next day in the ICU, he talked to the surgeon. He said, were you the guy with the Stars and Bars bandana on his head? And he goes, how'd you know that? Did you talk to the nurse? He goes, no, I was standing right next to you. And the surgeon didn't believe what he had said, but he said, and you're also listening to Lynyrd Skynyrd. And he kind of stuttered and said, I don't know how you know that. And he said, it's okay. I understand. I ran into my friend the day after my father died. He was in a patrol car. He stopped, he pulled over, and he said, I'm sorry about your dad, but you know what? I've seen where your dad is. It's beautiful. He's fine. Don't worry about it. Those were two NDE stories that were told to me by people I knew very personally. And it was something which I found was so enlightening. It helped lift the ancient veil of fear from me from when I was a child. This story was told to me over the phone. And every NDE story has a moral instruction to it. I had an old girlfriend who flew for one of the airlines, and she was into this as well. And she said, you know what, I'm going to introduce you to Philip. I flew with him for years. He lives in San Francisco with his partner, and he might be home. Let's give him a call. So we were at the Red Lion, and we called him, and he picked up, and she introduced me to him, and he said, hi, Colin. I said, hi, Philip, how are you doing? He goes, I'm fine. He said, Judy said you'll understand this. I said, absolutely. Go ahead. He said, well, I died in my doctor's office. I was feeling chest pains, and I called him. He said, get in here right now. His office was at the hospital, so I drove over, and in the middle of examining me, I died. I went black. I passed out. When I woke up, I was up on the ceiling, looking down at him working on me. And then this tunnel opened up to my right, and I went shooting down this tunnel towards this little speck of light. And the light seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I almost got there. He must have got me jump-started again because I came flying back. He said, that wasn't the strange part. He said, now I know I was on medication the following week in the ICU, but this thing would come into my room every day about the same time, sit at the end of my bed, and have conversations with me mind to mind. No words were spoken. It was solely mind to mind. The only way I could describe this being was it looked like one of the beings in the movie Cocoon. It was carved out of light, but it had a human form. And the first question I asked was, is there a God? It didn't say yes or no. It said, why do you think I'm here? I said, all right. And one day I said, what is the true religion? And he said, well, there is no really true religion. The religions of the world have kind of got it a little bit off kilter. The notion is to be spiritual, not to be religious so much. Religion has a tendency to separate people from themselves and from humanity. That serves a purpose, and it does have a moral guide to it, but there must be more spirituality. And he elucidated, he said, spirituality was understanding that you were connected to every other human being, that you were all connected, and then therefore you were connected to the great source. If you want to call it God, that's fine. the being stressed the importance of love, of taking care of people, and also of knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge. One day I asked it, what if you kill somebody? It looked aside, then it said, you just have to come back. He said, so there is reincarnation. He said, you call it reincarnation. We call it getting it right. He had no fear of death after that. It gave him a new definition of what life was. And for many people, once they have experienced this, their view of life is so different that they change their ways completely. And they can't believe that they've put value on things that really didn't matter, or what they thought mattered, but really didn't have the worth that they thought it was. Years ago, I had a drinking buddy who happened to be an ER doctor. And I asked him one day, I said, Joe, have you ever had anybody who was flatlined that came in? He goes, oh, yeah. I had a guy who was completely gone. He was flatlined, dead. And we brought him back. I said, did he describe anything afterwards? He goes, yeah. When I went and visited him in the ICU the next day, he said, oh, you're Dr. Thompson. And I said, yeah. He goes, when you came into the room, you were pulling your mask on. You had a tall guy behind you. And he said, did you talk to the nurse? Or he goes, no. I was up on the ceiling. I saw the whole thing. And you went over, you looked in my eyes, and you went over to a table. You took out a syringe. You did this, you did that. And he went through the whole list of things that my friend had done to him. And he was exactly accurate. And he said it stunned him because he never looked at a human body the same way again. He said the soul sits on the body like a hand and a glove. And he said once you take the hand out of the glove, all you have is the glove. But there's something which drives it. The last story I'm going to tell was about a man I knew. He was a professional. I won't say what profession he was in. But he had a debilitating disease which finally took his life. And he survived. He was brought back to life, but he talked about being in this other dimension. And when he was in this other dimension, he said he had this very loving, compassionate being behind him, showing him his life. This is often talked about in near-death experiences, that there is a life review, that you're shown your life. For him, and I've heard of this with other stories as well, for him, his life was shown to him from his point of view, from the person he was interacting with, their point of view, and from this being's point of view. So it was a three-pronged observation. His words and his actions, he was shown from his point of view, and he was also shown how it affected the person he was dealing with. And he said it was a real stopper. He said, you're forced to judge yourself. The being behind him, though, was very compassionate and wasn't condemnatory. It was just saying, well, you're just human. This, as long as you learn from this, this is what is the most important thing, is that you learn. When he had come back, his whole view of life had changed. Again, what he thought was important wasn't as important. The most important thing was to demonstrate love to others, to be able to look at a human being and to walk inside of their shoes, to see life as they did, not to think that he was as important as he was. And it was a real come down from where he thought life should be. And quite frequently this happens with people when they have near-death experiences. They change their view of life. They sometimes they get divorced. They realize, I'm not supposed to be with this person. They throw everything over. They lead a more, almost like a monastic life. They don't attach importance to material objects. Wealthy people have given away all their wealth. They lead a much more frugal life. they've demonstrated love on a much more consistent basis. And when you think about it, that's what this is all about. It's about love. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's fear. And for me, in all the years I've spent delving into this as a sort of a side project, that being the near-death experience, I've conquered quite a few of my fears. I've dealt with death on a personal basis quite a few times, but I fervently believe in what the Aramaic language points out, which is the language still spoken by the Assyrian people and was spoken by the Christ. Their word for death is malapta, which literally translated means not here, present elsewhere. That death is just a turning point. It's a sudden shift of consciousness. And as the ancient mystics said, we're spirits having a human experience, not humans having a spiritual experience. Keep your spirituality intact, keep it fine-tuned, and always be cognizant of the fact that love is always needed in the largest and smallest ways. For those of you who are interested in this area of near-death experience, I have a number of books to recommend. The first one, which was the groundbreaking one, Life After Life by Dr. Raymond A. Moody, Jr., MD. Heading Toward Omega by Kenneth Ring, which is about the search for the meaning of the near-death experience. The Scalpel and the Soul, Encounters with Surgery, the Supernatural, and the Healing Power of Hope by Alan J. Hamilton, MD, who is a neurosurgeon. Consciousness Beyond Life by Pim Van Lommel. Erasing Death by Sam Parnia. For those of you interested, that's a very good start. And I believe you'll find this to be an eye-opening experience. And you'll be surprised in conversation how many people have actually had this experience. I was having lunch with my wife and my daughter one day at a prominent restaurant here in Chicago. And I was talking about the subject. And my waiter came up. He overheard the conversation. And as he was putting the water on the table, he goes, "I'm a member of that club." I said, "What club?" "The Near-Death Club." I said, "Really? Pray tell." He said, I was a medic in the Army. I was killed in a battle in Afghanistan. And he said, "I was shown the universe. Don't worry. All your family who passed before you are waiting for you. They're just waiting for you to finish your job." And he walked away from the table, and my jaw hit the table. I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of Red Lion Pub Hub. We will continue with this subject in other chapters, and I want to thank all involved, including my engineer, Tony, who has been kind enough to put this together and edit it, which is no mean task. And I would like to add that the names used in the episodes, the personal episodes involved, have been changed for the privacy of those involved. This is Colin Cordwell, recording at the Red Lion Pub at 2446 North Lincoln Avenue, Chicago. Thank you, and we'll hook up again.